Here's what we're going to do today. And I want your opinions on this. Let me go down the whole list, and you can ask a question if you want as I go down the list as to exactly what I mean, because some of these things could go off in any number of directions. And I want your opinions on what I should prepare to cover in more depth in, say, the next 3 weeks. Okay? The first thing is that we've talked about different kinds of Christology. There's a Christology that's evidenced in the first 3 Gospels, which talks about Jesus, and he has a more human quality. And he was exalted then to the position of Christ, Son of God. So, and depending on the book, and in one of the books, he's exalted at 3 different times. You know, he can be exalted before he's born, because he's born by the action of God and the Spirit of God through Mary. That's a way he can be exalted. Another one is that he can be exalted. One of the books says at his baptism, you know, you are my son, and you know, it's like he's exalted then. And I won't quote the wording right now, but one of the books seems to say, okay, it's right now that you are now made my son. And a third view is that he was exalted when he was raised, or as he was crucified, in the crucifixion and resurrection experience. So that's an exalted Christology, as opposed to the high Christology, which was the idea that he was, like in the book of John, that he existed before creation, that he was not exalted by God, that he existed through all time, both the time we experience and a spiritual time that spans all of existence, that he was the Son of God then, and when he came to earth, and now he was an angelic being, a divine being brought down to earth. So he was divine long before Mary was ever born. Okay, so that's and Paul speaks a little bit of this high Christology, not quite like John, but he says basically, you know, I teach Jesus and Jesus crucified. I teach Jesus as this holy being, and not covering a period where he's sort of interacting as a person with other people here.
Okay, so that's number 1.
That's number 1.
Okay.
And I'll go through these again. Okay?
Number 1 is the Christology in comparison in the books.
Okay. And you can hear me, Larry? Okay, yeah, that's a high versus, do we want to look at what the differences are between a high and low Christology,
Okay.
meaning an exaltation Christology where he is exalted at some point, whether it's right before birth or at baptism or at the resurrection, versus always been the Son of God.
Okay.
Okay, the second is, who wrote the Pauline epistles and when? Because there's 7 epistles that biblical scholars have said, yes, Paul wrote these. These are Paul. This is his writing style. This is his message. And then there's what's called the Deuteropauline. There's 3 books. And in those 3 books, it differs from Paul. And we're not the only ones who say today, it's not modern skeptics and ungodly people saying, oh, well, Paul may not have written this. Origen, these people who were figuring out in the beginning what were the divine texts to include in the canon and what were not. Origen, just so that you know, he at one point says about one of the Deuteropauline epistles, they call it Deutero because it's in the second place. In other words, these have some of Paul's teachings and some things that contradict, but we don't think that Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, and Ephesians. And that's the wide majority of people who are studying these critically.
Okay, so that's the second choice
Right,
about
right.
Paul's
And-
letters, okay?
And just so you know, it's not just modern people picking at the words. Back in the 3rd century, one of the early church fathers said, he said, now I copied this on here. In the 3rd century, Origen wrote, for instance, in the epistle entitled To the Hebrews, the diction does not exhibit the characteristic roughness of speech or phraseology admitted by the Apostle Paul himself. The construction of the sentences is closer to the Greek usage, as anyone capable of recognizing differences of style would agree. On the other hand, the matter of the epistle is wonderful and quite equal to the apostles' acknowledged writing. So, in some cases, the Deuteropauline epistles, those 3 that I mentioned, are considered, well,
She lowered
be-
it.
Is it gone?
No, she just lowered it.
because of the ideas expressed, the theology expressed, because of the words, and because of other reasons, these are probably not Paul. And then we've got the third set, which is the pastoral epistles, and those, like Timothy, and those have broad differences with Paul, both in language and especially in some of the fundamental teachings. And we know that there were false letters attributed, or letters falsely attributed to Paul, because one of our books of the New Testament said, hey, there's this letter, and ignore that because it's fake. It's attributed to Paul, but it's fake. And then we also get into like Hebrews, the epistle to the Hebrews. That's in our canon because some early church figures thought it was Paul, but it never says that it was Paul. And it's not Paul-like. So anyway,
So that's the third one.
we'll go back. No, that's the second
Well,
one.
that's still the second.
Yeah, who wrote the Pauline epistles, and what
Okay.
are the 3 different groups of
Okay.
Pauline epistles, and which ones do we think Paul wrote and why? Which ones do we think were written later, and which ones are we pretty sure almost all scholars agree?
Did Larry get that?
It just stopped. Because, no, I think they stopped it, they were busy with him or something, it looked like.
Oh.
He was not on
They
the
were
screen
saying
very
something
much.
about
Yeah.
a belt, so I think he
Yeah,
did,
they're
yeah.
probably doing something with
Oh.
him, yeah.
I can send him this by
Okay,
Email.
okay, but he'd like to be on this as soon as he can, I know.
all right.
Yeah,
I can give him this one-on-one too, okay? And the next one, number 3, is a look at the history of Christian thought. Because we can look at the Gospels and we can think, well, they went from a low Christology with Mark through Matthew and Luke to John, and by John it's a high Christology. And we know this, they were written in sequentially in time. So was this high Christology when the church matured and developed theologically, or were these 2 schools of thought competing as to what should form the basis of the Christian church? And the reason we know that they were about the same time is because what's the oldest, or what do we think, not the oldest physical copies, but what's the earliest Christian writings we have?
Mark?
No, Mark's the first gospel. What do we have that's older than Mark?
Old Testament?
Those Dead Sea Scrolls?
No, that's Old Testament. No, a Christian. The oldest Christian stuff we have is the letters of Paul.
Oh,
The
the
letters of
letters of Paul are the oldest Christian stuff we have?
they were written before the Gospels were written
Oh.
down. Now,
Oh,
Now these
Oh.
these stories were, of course, circulating. That's why they were written down into our Gospels. So there's this view of Jesus as you get in Mark, and there's this view of Jesus that you get in Paul, and of course Mark saying, and the early Gospels said, yeah, you got to follow the law better than the Pharisees and the scribes, but Paul is saying, if you try to follow the Jewish law, you will endanger your salvation. As a matter of fact, you can't do that. So, it's convenient to think, oh, well, it was this which covers the life of Jesus, and then it matured into this. But no, they were at the same time, and they were competing. They were jockeying to see which vision of Christianity would triumph.
So let me catch Maggie up, what's going on.
Sorry, I was my sister is sick and I was on the phone with her.
It's
so
okay,
sorry.
Maggie. Larry,
Yeah, I was
Larry is trying to get in on this, but he's in rehab, and
Oh.
the nurses shut him down for a bit, so
Okay,
he's
okay.
off right now. And what Steve's doing is presenting several different things and asking us what we want to hear the next 3 weeks.
Oh, okay.
And this was the third one about comparing the letters to the
I'll run over those three real quick.
Okay,
Okay.
that was the third
Number
choice.
number one was,
Well, you're gonna do it at the end anyway, might as well go to 4.
well, I'm just going to give her just real quick.
Okay.
One is
We need the
is
review anyway.
one is low Christology versus high Christology, one in which Jesus is exalted at some time right before his life or during his life, either at baptism or resurrection, and then he is the Son of God, versus the high Christology, which said he was always the Son of God from before creation. And do we want to look at what the differences are between those two kinds of views of Jesus? Because it has some fundamental issues involved with it that affect Christianity.
Right.
And do we want to look at the contrast and compare of those two? The second was Paul wrote most of the books of the New Testament, or so they're attributed to him. We know 7 of them that almost all biblical scholars agree, yes, these are written by Paul. But then the rest of them, like the Deuteropauline, which means second-tier Pauline, they're probably not Paul. They're not the same language at all. And it's not just us, and it's not just modern people. It was people back like Origen, back in the 3rd century, saying, no, this book was not written by Paul. It's not his language. And there's a lot of philosophy in the pastoral epistles and the Deuteropauline epistles that let us know this is very unlikely to be Paul. Okay.
That's the second one, right?
Right.
Right.
The third is the history of Christian thought and the parallel different forms that were rising up. Some people know of some variations of Christianity like the Gnostics. Well, the Gnostics were a little bit of a later development, and they're not quite as attractive to philosophically as sort of New Age thinking would have you. It's not just that Gnostis meaning knowing. It's not just that we get revealed the Scripture's meaning to us through study and communication with Jesus. It's a whole nother thing with a angry creator God and a later better God. At any rate, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about history of Christian thought in parallel. There were different Christologies, almost like what we were talking about earlier, but the competition between these different groups at the same time with different visions of Christianity and where it ought to go. Okay, number 4, anti-Semitism within Christianity. Do we want to look at that? Is that a thing? Yes, it's very much a thing. You can look at the book of John, which is the most beautifully written of all of them, and he says, Jews aren't the children of God, they're the children of the devil. And there's quite a few places in the books where it says basically that, upon us and our children will be his blood. And good heavens. There's do we want to look at how a Jewish man or divine person, anyway, Jesus was Jewish, his culture was Jewish, he was teaching in a messianic Jewish tradition using the Jewish law. And how did we come to say, that his religion is bad or even vile and evil or demonic?
And that happened in John, you're saying?
No, it happened in a lot of places.
Oh.
It's just, do we want to look at the rising of
Oh.
anti-Semitism as a theme within Christianity? Okay. It is very prominent in John, but it's not just in John. Okay. And it goes all the way from early on. Jesus is saying, yeah, don't waste your time with the Gentiles. We're here to teach the children of God and, the Jewish people to a lot of anti-Semitism. Okay, number 5. Persecution of Christians. Do we want to look at the reality and the unreality? How did Christians fit in with society? What did society think about them? Was it illegal to be Christians? And for most of the period, it was not.
You mean for the first 300 years or when?
Yeah,
Okay.
before Constantine,
Before
Constantine converted, and but were they? And they definitely were persecuted and made outlaw about 250 A.D. under one particular pagan Roman emperor. But for most of the time, it was fine. It was illegal for anybody to have any sort of worship as long as you didn't advocate antisocial behavior that would bring down order. Okay, so do we want to look at persecution of Christians, the reality, and the popular myth?
That's number 5?
That's number 5. And
Okay.
we'll go over these at the end too. Number 6. And this one is, to me, it's fascinating because for many years I hadn't even thought about this. Do we want to look at the different books, like maybe just the Gospels, and say which are the words of the author of the book and which are the words of Jesus? And in some cases, it's rather benign. It's that scholars will look and they'll say that this parable that Jesus gives is almost certainly something that Jesus gave. But then he explains it right after that to his disciples as like an aside. That's probably not. He probably said the parable. He didn't go into the footnote. That's just Hollywood news. That's something that's not a hospital thing. All right. And
Do you think they'll be able to get us back on when they're done, JM?
I don't know.
I'll
You could call
talk.
him back and see
Okay,
if.
because I know he wants to hear this, and it's good for him.
It'll also be on YouTube.
Okay, but he'd like to be part of this class.
Okay.
I don't know what happened.
Yeah, I'd certainly like him to be part, but I don't know if
He
they're going
does
to.
want to be.
And so, do we want to look at the books of the Bible, especially like the first Gospels, and say, we think these are the authentic words of Jesus? And there's some tests for this too that people have used since the very beginning. For instance, one of the tests is, would Christians have made this up? And that's not to accuse Christians of making things up. That's just to say, is this unlikely to be something in the book? For instance, Jesus is criticized when he preaches in his hometown, and his family comes to take him and saying, nah, he's out of his mind. Is this something early Christians would have later made up and written in? I don't think so. These are things, there are things in the various books where Jesus kind of, it's shocking. It's some of the most powerful stuff. It's like when they say, you're ever not following the dietary laws. And he said, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And it's like, that's going against Jewish law. That's going to create an uproar. And he says, well, you have to follow the law. Why is he not following? So no one would have made that up to put that in there probably. Although many of these are the most powerful messages in the Bible.
So that's number 6?
That is number 6. Words of the authors, like what in the book of Mark is likely that Jesus said, or said very nearly close to that, and what he didn't. And I'm going to jump back. One quick thing is when we talk about the Pauline epistles, who wrote them and how they tell sometimes by the language, like Origen saying this is not the language of Paul, you can't tell that in the English translation, because all the books of Paul, when they're translated into English, they break up these monstrous sentences that are in some of these ones they don't think Paul wrote. You know, it's like run on 100-word sentences instead of short, choppy, terse things. But if you do it in the original Greek, then you understand, okay, this does not sound like Paul at all. Okay, so words of the authors, words of Jesus. That's number 6. Number 7, and this is a bookseller par excellence, and it has been for a long time. Revelations. Why, what does Revelations mean? What's the book actually about? And what does it mean? And what does it mean when all these popular authors say, we are in the end times? The signs have never been reflected as they are in the events today. There are wars and rumors of war. There's plagues and disasters. My gosh, there's never been a time. Well, no, Christian writers have been saying that since there's been Christian writing. Every era is always the fulfillment. And when they talk about, wars and rumors of war, there's never been a troubled time like this, I'm going, well, you didn't live through World War I, the Great Depression, and World War II, did you? You didn't live when Napoleon plunged Europe into constant war for decades. You didn't live in the 30 Years' War when it was or wars of religion when Christians and Jews were slaughtering each other and everybody was slaughtering peasants. My own relative was killed in one of those because he wouldn't convert from his religion to the other. He was probably a Protestant in a Catholic area of Switzerland, but both sides were doing that to each other. So it's not just evil Catholics. It was not Christian behavior. All right. So do we want to study the book of Revelations? That's 7. And then number 8, do we want to study Christian apologists? Because from the early days of Christianity, when people were saying, these Christians, they meet at night and they call each other brother and sister and kiss each other in greeting, and that's really incestuous. And then they drink the blood of their Savior and eat his body. And then, they said, so they just come up with all this riotous rumor to make Christians look bad. Because especially when it wasn't illegal to be a Christian for most of the time, but if the local gods are being worshipped by most people and then you have a crop failure, normally they thought, well, people aren't giving homage to the local god, and this is punishment, just like a lot of the Jewish history is. You've strayed, you get conquered by somebody because you've strayed from the will and behavior that God wishes for you. You've been disloyal to me and your promises, and so therefore I bring down upon you, an invading army. Well, they did that too. Other people did that too. But Christian apologists wrote saying, all right, Christianity has all these wonderful, beautiful things. And it goes up till today, because I can look at a book like Bart Ehrman's books, which reflect really what's taught in seminaries, but is not what preached from the pulpit. And then somebody else will write a book that says, oh, everything that Bart Ehrman says, including the words a and thee, is incorrect. There's still this fight. One of the most famous is that you all know, who's the guy that wrote the Chronicles of Narnia? C.S. Lewis. Well, he was popular. He was a popular Christian apologist, and he came up with a catchy thing in my lifetime, before you were born, that said, well, Jesus, he made all these claims about being the Son of God, because he's looking at, the book of John and such, saying he's making these claims being the Son of God, so he either was a liar, a lord, or a lunatic. That's the only 3 choices you can make. He was either knew he wasn't the Son of God and said he was, so he's a liar. It puts aside the fact that the book of John doesn't necessarily say what Jesus said. Or he's Lord of all. Or he didn't know he was wrong when he said he was the Son of God, so he's a lunatic, and that's the only choice you have. So
C.S. Lewis had a lot of controversy over his religion and that when he was writing his books and that, especially Chronicles of Narnia.
Yep, exactly. And Chronicles of Narnia, I wanted to like that, but in every case you get everything is falling and then the lion comes or God comes and poof, it's all fixed. It's like in the
Miraculous.
last minute of the last episode, bang, it's all fixed. Okay, let's read the next book where everything again goes to Hades, and at the last minute, you know, you can set your watch by what was the name of the lion?
No, in the Chronicles of Narnia. Oh,
Yeah,
oh my
you-
gosh.
Yeah. Okay, the lion was my gosh. No, the lion, I forgot his name. But at any rate, he would always show up right at the last 2 pages. So,
And so what was the choice here of the number 8? We're going to look at this guy or
Christian apologists.
And
No,
he's
the
one of
history, just Christian apologists. In other words, when people have criticized Christianity and said that this is a deviant movement and that these people are this may sound a little familiar with some of the accusations made today. They said
Yeah, I was gonna
they're
say, it could be
they're
21st
child
century.
murderers and child traffickers. They take babies and they cover them with flour and then they kill them with blows and then this is how you become a Christian, and then they drink the blood. It's like, oh yeah, they're taking the communion ceremony and presenting it as murder. There's no parallels with that today, is there? All right, and then the last one is Bible study. Do we want to do like we did before, where we go back and say, look, maybe in a more accelerated pace, maybe even doing the same pace, just doing the book of, say, Mark, and then sometime later down the year when you all recover from my teaching and you can decide, well, we don't have anybody else, and
Well, then we'll do Matthew.
and if we suffer now, we'll prosper in heaven. All right, so we have, do we want to look at exaltation Christology versus incarnation Christology, high versus low, so to speak, views of Christ? Just the theory, not necessarily the history, but just the theory. What's the difference between the two? The second thing is, do we want to look at the Pauline epistles and the 3 natural groups that they fall in, the undisputed Pauline letters, and these are the earliest writings we have in Christianity. The second is the Deuteropauline, which means second tier. They kind of sound like Paul, but there's some things to put them in to make them suspect as far as being written by somebody else. And then the third group is the pastoral epistles, and then there's the book of Hebrews that was thought by 2nd and 3rd century people to be Pauline, but it's not. It doesn't say it's by Paul, and it's not. It's more anti-Jewish really than anything else. It's showing how Christianity is superior to Judaism. It may be our first surviving complete sermon because it's basically a sermon.
Hebrews?
Huh?
Hebrews, you're
The book
saying?
of Hebrews, yeah. So Pauline epistles, the different groups, and why do we think Paul wrote some and don't think Paul wrote some of the others?
Is that number 3?
No, 3 is history of Christian thought.
Oh.
And, the parallel Christianities that were growing up at the same time, kind of comparing, oh, wait a minute, look, there were 2 different schools of thought, and the one that we have now is that triumphed, the Orthodox view that became accepted, was not the only one. And at one time, it wasn't even the primary one. Okay?
You mean the Gnostic Gospels? Is that
No.
that's something else.
Gnosticism's a little late. Oh, there's
Okay,
all sorts of different branches that go off, but I'm talking about the main ideas
Okay.
of say Jesus as a pre-existent divine
Oh, okay.
being,
Yeah.
and the sort of Pauline view where you don't have to follow the law, and the gospel view where you do have to follow the law.
Okay.
We have number 4 is anti-Semitism within Christianity. Number 5 is persecution or not of Christians through early church history. Number 6, because we have this idea they're all in catacombs or eaten by lions if they get discovered, and that's not the case. 6, what in, say, the Gospels is the words of Jesus, and the idea of scholars who study this all the time, because it seems to be the authentic voice of Jesus, and what is the voice of the author trying to say something that they want to add or that they think was part of Jesus, but he just needs a little emphasis. So Revelations, do we want to look at Revelations and find out who the Whore of Babylon is, and is this really something that's going to occur imminently or not? And one of the things, I'll jump back just a little bit, is that when we talk about the different kinds of high versus low Christology or the history of Christian thought, we're also going to be looking at the book of James, because in the book of James, for instance, that's one of the best contrasts between just believing in the death and resurrection of Jesus, as Paul says, or James says what about faith without
Gotta have
works?
Good works.
Yeah, he said faith without works is dead. Yes. Does that agree with Paul? No. Paul would say, all right, if you believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus, if you're saved, then you will live a moral life just as a consequence. But James is not saying that. James is saying, and James is attributed to be the brother of Jesus, but maybe not, but the words are it seems to be a very old school, it's early Christian thinking. So it's closer to the time of Jesus.
That's one of Gordon's favorite chapters.
Oh, I absolutely,
But he's not here.
I love that book. I love the book of James.
Yeah.
All right. Revelations, Christian apologists then and now, people who were apologizing and supporting Christianity against attacks by, say, the Romans, and then down to people today who support, say, an old view and say, if you think something different, if you say that the earth rotates around the sun instead of the sun rotating around the earth, then we're going to burn you to death, because you are opposing our standard view of biblical thought. Okay, and it's both people who would kill you for it and people like C.S. Lewis who are saying, liar, lord, or lunatic. That's the only 3 ways you can possibly look at it, which is reducing it all down to a bumper sticker. Okay, and the last one is biblical study. Okay, now I'm going to go around the table and I'm going to ask you, was there anything that particularly resonated?
We could have 2, couldn't we?
You can have as many as you want. I'm just going to put a little X by each one that
3,
gets
4, and
some.
5, the anti-Semitism
Okay,
one.
okay. I'll start with you.
Good.
Okay. And do you have and if you have this is the one I'm most interested in, or if it's all the same.
That one, but I also like the one.
Okay. Wait. Which one's
I
first?
like anti-Semitism.
Is that number 1, or is that equal with the other 2?
That's equal, and then I like
Okay.
the one where we talk about the different parallels of different Christianity. How one group thought this, one group thought that. Those 2 I like both of those 2 equally.
You mean the rise of Krishna, or the exaltation versus the? Sounds like you're talking about the exaltation versus the incarnation.
Yes.
The one, yes.
Yes.
Okay, all right. And the third one, exaltation versus incarnation. Who wrote the Pauline epistles, or who wrote the
And
Pauline?
the anti-Semitism one.
The anti-Semitism, history of church thought, persecution.
Persecution.
Okay, persecution. Then there's words of the authors versus words of Jesus in the books, and Revelations, Christian apologists, and Bible study.
I like persecution, anti-Semitism. I like Revelations. I like the parallel. I like them almost all.
Okay, you want me to put a check by Revelations too?
Yes, I like Revelations. Yeah.
All right.
I don't know that much about Revelations. I'll be honest with you. So
Okay.
that would be like a.
Almost nobody gets what Revelations
Yeah.
is.
I know.
It's like
So
it's
that
like
would
it's
really
about
be-
it's about. I won't say spoilers, but okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I'll go last.
Okay, you wait. who wants to vote next?
I vote what Maggie had, I'm interested in those subjects.
In all those subjects, okay? I'm gonna put a second X by this. This sounds like a conspiracy. Have you guys been passing notes in class?
Oh, I have only one I really want.
Okay, what is that?
The anti-Semitism, because I have always not understood how Christians could be anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
That is something that is totally foreign to me.
And I think
Yep.
what would be very interesting, to me at least, would be to draw the parallels between history to now.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it's still.
Oh, that's
through the
gonna be
ages.
part of it,
I
yeah.
just, I have never understood. I mean, I know what, like the Catholics said, because they were the ones that voted to crucify Christ, but that's what I've always heard was the reason, but I'm sure there's other things in the Bible, and that's something I have never understood.
Well, if I do that, I was thinking of doing that and not just staying in their history. I was going to go a little bit beyond. I was going to give the roots of it in the Bible, but I was going to
Well,
talk
that's what
about
I would like to figure that out, because I have never understood it.
yeah, I couldn't even get.
Jesus was a Jew, how can you hate Jews? It just doesn't resonate with my thought process.
I wonder,
They'll tell you that Jesus wasn't a Jew. He was
That's
the Son of
right.
God.
That's
Yeah,
right.
that's right. I think, Barb, that's it. If you ask a lot of people, is Jesus a Jew? And they say, oh, no.
He's the Son of
They
God.
say, no, of course he isn't.
Of course, they also say, if English was, if the King James Bible was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me.
Yeah.
I think Jesus, this is my personal thought, when I hear all this, when people say, oh, Jesus was black, Jesus was Jew, I just feel like Jesus is like water. Or God, we make him into whatever we are comfortable with,
Right.
is what I think.
And that's not a bad thing.
Yes.
Unless you say
Because
like
it's a very
Jesus was a
personal
white,
thing.
blonde, blue-eyed, and so anybody who has dark skin
Yeah, I
is,
don't
you know,
think there's anything
child of the
wrong with
devil.
that.
Unless
No.
you use his appearance to
Exactly.
penalize or punish other people for being
Exactly,
who they
I
are.
don't think
Yeah.
there's anything wrong with that,
Yeah.
because it makes it easier to relate to him.
It does, it
If
does.
you what do they say, there's that one thing about, God, we make God in our own image,
Yeah.
so
Same thing with
it's the
Jesus.
same thing.
Yeah.
We can do that, but as long as we don't say, well,
We're not
you're
hateful
bad
to
because
others.
don't do
Okay.
it.
I'll go with Ann.
Oh, it's anti-Semitism, and that's like a priority one there. Looks like we have a theme here. Okay.
You two haven't voted, or you
Oh, I
haven't
did,
voted.
I said I would.
What do you think?
She had
Okay.
quite a few, but I'll just go with Ann and Carol on the Addison. That's why I said whatever Ann said.
Thank you.
You're
You're welcome.
I got the
Something
yeah.
else
didn't come out.
I really wanna hear the history, I mean, cause like I said, it's one of those.
Well, for years I thought God and Jesus was the same person. I mean, growing up.
Yes,
And I it was like, I have a hard time even defining who's who and, cause they'd say Lord this and God this and, and I'm like, whoa. But, until I was a teenager, adult, I had no clue the difference between who's who, and so,
Well, in
Just
in
the-
many ways, that may have been exactly what was taught to you, because they'll say, when you look upon me, you see the Father, and it says, I am one with the Father in different places in the Bible. It has that identification of Jesus and the Father being part of the same, so it would make, you
That's
probably
probably
were
a-
taught that.
That's probably a study in itself,
mhm.
of how we got that, 3-in-1 God.
Oh, that's
Three in
a
one
big
God.
Way too deep
that's
for me.
yeah, the Trinity, the doctrine of the
Yeah,
Trinity.
Trinity is-
And
oh.
and when did that come up, and how was that accepted? And that was a couple hundred years before that ever got, or about 300 years before that ever got settled. And there's even the only part in the Bible, the only verse that actually says, there's plenty of things that can be interpreted as the Trinity, but the only thing that actually says that was something that was added in later.
Interesting.
Probably to throw that in.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Okay, I'm with Ann on that one, and about this anti-Semitism. But I also like your comparison of the Christology and, the first one it was.
exaltation Christology
Yeah.
versus incarnation Christology.
That's very interesting too.
Okay, and yours?
I'm gonna go with the group, with the anti-Semitism, but the high and low Christology as
Yeah.
well.
Okay.
When you said that a while ago, I'm going, okay, then.
Well, I just wonder if there's some correlation that would build into like more modern history with the Holocaust and all of that.
Well, it builds all the way through history.
That would be interesting to me.
Yeah.
And there's it's an interesting bag. I tell you what, I couldn't even finish Ivanhoe because the guy who's the poor Jewish fellow and his daughter, it's vile. And it's supposed to be that, he's awakening to this beauty and value in this guy's daughter, the Jewish guy's daughter. But it's terrible. And in the Crusades, when people were going to go off to the Crusades, sometimes they would say, why should we go off to fight for the sacred holy lands and leave the Christ killers behind? And they would go and rampage through Jewish sections of cities and murder them. Now there was a New Testament guide. There's the idea that Christians are not supposed to charge interest to one another. They're not supposed to use usury. In other words, you can't loan money to somebody. You can loan money to somebody, but you can't loan it to them with interest. If I lend you $50, I can't ask for more than $50 in return.
Or profit,
That's in the Bible, yes.
Oh,
profiteer.
Christians are not allowed to use usury, to be
Call
usurers.
Monday, call Monday.
And so the Jews were necessary.
Yeah.
The Jews, because a lot of these say a ruler wants to finance a war and he doesn't have the money, he's got to borrow the money, but he couldn't borrow it from a good Christian, so he borrows it from Jews. So what's a real good trick then when you owe lots and lots and lots of money because of your lifestyle and your wars and your mismanagement or just normal management? Bad. You kill them and you burn down their place and destroy all the records of the money you owed them. But
that works.
yeah, it just, so that's a more recent history in it. And the Third Reich in many ways was a way it was the big lie. It was Germany did not lose. One of the reasons why they got so many people on board of that is, aside from anti-Semitism running as a thread through much of Europe, and Germany and Russia especially, but they said, our army never lost. We were never defeated in the field. That we were stabbed in the back by communists
You
and
mean World War One?
World War I. Yeah,
Yeah.
that Hitler and the Nazis said that we were stabbed in the back, that our armies would have won the war except for the weakness of liberal politicians, communists, and Jews. And it's the big lie. And you just say it over and over. And Hitler said, don't tell the little lie, tell the big lie. And tell it enough times, it'll just go into their brain, which scares me today when I see the politics. Okay,
It worked for World War Two. He
yeah.
got that going.
yep, he got the German people behind
But they were
him.
starving. Those German people didn't have.
They had nothing. My mom,
They were starving.
my and Bargain, Mary came to, we're from Bremerhaven, Germany, and my moms were Jewish. And the stories she would tell me of their lives over there, and my grandparents were fairly rich in those days, and they lost everything, and I can't tell you how many relatives
In
of mine were
World
killed.
War One or
World War I and II.
but World War One, it was really
No,
bad.
no. She's talking about, I think, in the period after World War I.
Right.
They actually had
Right.
the finances went down to nothing, but then it had bounced back. So they were not in the midst of the debacle, the worst of the post-war debacle when Hitler was engineering
But I
support.
thought that's what he did for them. He brought them back from the brink of.
No, they had recovered in many ways from the worst of the currency problems. He brought full employment. And somebody said, and we're getting close to the end here, but somebody said an interesting thing. It was an American who came up with some of the ideas for Hitler's rallies, and he said, you know, through the proper use of propaganda, we can make people living in heaven think they're living, people in hell think they're living in heaven. And Hitler said, that's not the trick, that's easy, comparatively. He said, the real trick is through the proper use of propaganda, you can make people living in heaven think they're living in hell. And given the loss of a generation in World War I, and given the devastation of the German economy and the starvation during the war, and given the collapse of the German currency and all their savings, and given fighting in the streets between right-wing and left-wing little armies, you know, the civil war they had, given the full prosperity now and full employment, and that Germany had been reestablished as one of the primary nations on the world, and given that they were strong and growing stronger in the economy, and a world leader in many things again, and now accepted back as a full member of the community of nations, they were living in heaven compared to
What year, 1930s?
1930, late 30s, okay?
Okay.
You know, that compared to that, but then Hitler, through the use of propaganda, he got them to fear his enemies so much, to think you're living in hell, you're surrounded by enemies who will destroy you, much like Putin is doing right now. NATO is going to invade, so we have to invade Ukraine in self-defense. But what they're doing is he used the specter of Bolshevism and Western countries that are going to come in and take away. Yeah, they're going to take away your radio and, you know, and kill your babies and all this, and he made them follow him into the Holocaust, into World War II, all the way through World War II, through being pounded flat by Allied bombers, all the way until they physically occupied 90-something% of German territory. So he got them to follow. So through the clever use of propaganda, you can make people think living in heaven is hell.
Yeah.
So, all right, so it sounds like, even with my math skills, that we had 3 primary votes and 4 other votes for anti-Semitism within Christianity. So we'll look at that. We'll look at it within the biblical writings, we'll look at it within history, and we'll look at it in more modern times.
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
Okay, who would like to close us out with a prayer?
Ann likes to pray us out. Thank you, Ann.
Ann just likes to pray all the time.
You know what? Somebody once said to me about a Muslim person. They said, I'm very suspicious. I said, they pray like 5 times a day. And I told them, I said, that's a good start.
Yeah.
That's probably the bare minimum. You know, we should be
Yeah.
doing that with every breath if we could, but we don't.
Again, our Heavenly Father, we thank you for the blessings that we have received and the knowledge that we will obtain. Guide us as we continue our lives, as we live our lives this coming week. And again, I ask for healing for those who are ill and comfort for those who have lost loved ones. We ask these blessings in thy Son's name. Amen.
Amen.
So.
Larry
Okay,
we'll
I'll
put
tell
this
Larry.
online.
Hands for black.
I'll